I was 500 miles away when they walked through my front door. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a little notification from my security app, motion detected, front entry, and for a moment I thought it was the neighbor's cat or a delivery left on the porch. Then the second alert came, interior motion, and I pulled over on a quiet stretch of highway outside Charlottesville and opened the live feed. There was my father in my hallway. There was my sister right behind him. They moved through my house like they owned it, like it already belonged to them, like my mother had never existed, or if she had, her wishes had simply expired. I watched the whole thing from a parking lot on the side of Route 250. I did not call them. I did not call the police, not yet. I just watched, and I remembered every second, and somewhere in the stillness of that car, I made a decision that would take several weeks to execute, and that would end with my father, my sister, and the woman who had enabled them all their lives sitting in a room together, listening to their own voices play back at them, with nowhere left to go. But to understand how I got to that parking lot, I have to go back a little further. I have to go back to my mother, and to the house she left me, and to the family that never forgave her for it. Before we start, if you've ever stayed completely quiet when everything in you wanted to scream, and then waited until the moment was exactly right, type, "I waited" in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. A new story drops every week, and this one is just getting started. My mother's name was Margaret. She grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in a family where names meant something and the houses they lived in meant even more. She was the kind of woman who pressed flowers in books and remembered everyone's birthday and made the same sweet potato casserole every Thanksgiving for 30 years without once being asked. She was generous in the way that quiet women sometimes are, so consistently, so reliably, that the people around her slowly stopped noticing. And some of them, the wrong ones, started to believe that her generosity was a resource they were simply entitled to draw from. My father, Gareth, was one of those people. He and my mother divorced when I was 17, and my sister Rowena was 12. My mother kept the house, the craftsman bungalow in the Fan District that her own parents had left her. My father kept the opinion that she had handled everything incorrectly, and that he had been somehow cheated, a conviction he nurtured for the next 2 decades with the focus of a man tending a very particular kind of fire. He remarried eventually, moved across town, and built a life that looked settled from the outside. But he never stopped talking about that house. At holiday dinners, at cousins' gatherings, in small asides to Rowena that I was not supposed to hear, the house was always there. A wrong that had been done to him. A thing that ought, by rights, to have been his. When my mother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia 4 years ago, my father's interest in the house sharpened noticeably. I was the one who managed her care, the appointments, the medications, the home health aide on weekdays, the long phone calls with her doctors, the quiet nights sitting with her while she told me stories she'd already told me 20 times, and I listened like it was the first time, every time. Rowena visited when it was convenient. My father called occasionally, always finding a way to turn the conversation around to the property, asking careful questions about whether my mother had updated her arrangements lately, whether she had a financial advisor looking after things. She had me. I am a financial advisor. I had been looking after things for years. My mother passed 18 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in April, in the room she had slept in her whole adult life, with the Fan District light coming through her curtains and me sitting in the chair beside her bed. She left the house to me. Solely, specifically, unambiguously, to me. Her will was clear. Her lawyer was thorough. The deed transferred without complication. My daughter Lily, who was 8 at the time, called it our forever house. And I cried in the kitchen where she couldn't see me, because that was exactly what her grandmother would have called it too. My father and sister did not take the news the way I had hoped. Rowena stopped returning my calls for 3 months. My father sent a letter, an actual letter, typed on paper, informing me that he believed there were questions about the circumstances of the will that he intended to explore. I read it once. I put it in a folder. I did not reply. I told myself they would process it in their own time. I told myself family was complicated, and grief made people act in ways they wouldn't otherwise. I gave them every penny. Fit of the doubt I had. The house sat on a corner lot on West Avenue, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a front porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table, which was exactly how my mother had always arranged it. When Lily and I moved in, I kept the porch the same. I kept the sweet potato casserole recipe on the index card my mother had written it on, tucked in the recipe box on the second shelf, between the card for chicken and dumplings and the one for her lemon pound cake. I kept her writing desk in the study, a small cherrywood secretary's desk with a fold-down lid and a dozen tiny interior compartments, the kind of piece that looked modest until you really looked at it, and then you understood it had been in the family for a long time and was not going anywhere. I run my practice from the house, Fairfax Advisory, Independent Financial Planning, a client list I built over 12 years of slow, careful work. My home office is off the kitchen. 2 monitors, a filing cabinet, a printer, and a backup drive I update every Friday. I am meticulous about records. I always have been. It is, in some ways, the thing I am best at, seeing the shape of things on paper, noting what is there and what is missing, keeping a file on everything that matters. 2 years ago, after a break-in 3 streets over, I had a security system installed. 4 cameras, front porch, back door, the living room, and the hallway outside my office. All of them audio-enabled, all cloud-backed, accessible from my phone in real time. The company that installed it walked me through every feature. I set up motion alerts. I tested the audio. I made sure the cloud archive kept 30 days of footage, not 7. I don't know exactly why I was so thorough about that last detail. Call it professional habit. Call it a quiet instinct I had learned to trust. Lily was 9 by last spring. On the first Friday of May, I drove up to Charlottesville for a 4-day work conference, a continuing education requirement I had been planning since January. Lily stayed with our neighbor, Patricia, not a villain in this story, just a good woman with a warm house 2 doors down who had known Lily since she was a baby. The arrangement was simple. Lily had Patricia's number. Patricia had mine. Everything was accounted for. I was 3 hours into the drive home on Monday afternoon when Lily called me crying. She had been at Patricia's front window. She had seen the lights on in our house. She had recognized the car in the driveway. "Mommy," she said, her voice very small, "Grandpa Gareth is in our house." I told her to stay with Patricia. I told her everything was fine. I kept my voice even and calm the way I always do when she needs me to be steady, even when I am not. I hung up the phone. I pulled over. I opened the security app. The live feed loaded within seconds. Front camera. My father's silver Buick parked half on the curb, the way he always parked, like the curb was a suggestion. Interior camera, hallway, movement. Living room, clear. I switched to the study camera, and there was Rowena, standing in front of my mother's writing desk with the fold-down lid open, going through the small interior compartments one by one with the focused efficiency of someone who knew what she was looking for. My hands did not move. My face did not change. I turned off the radio and I watched. Gareth came into the frame from the left. He was wearing his Saturday jacket, the brown canvas one he wore when he wanted to look like he was just stopping by for something casual. He said something to Rowena and she shook her head, then pointed to the lower compartment on the right side, and Gareth reached in and moved a small tray and lifted something out. I could see it clearly even on the phone screen. It was a key, a small brass key on a green plastic tag. The key to my mother's storage unit on Broad Street, where I kept several boxes of her things I had not yet had the heart to sort through, her good china, the photo albums, and the cedar box where she kept the jewelry she had been given over her lifetime, pieces that had come from her mother and her mother's mother, things that had meaning and some of which had considerable value. Rowena closed the desk lid. Gareth put the key in his jacket pocket. He looked around the study the way a person does when they are checking whether they have what they came for, and then he said, clearly enough for the microphone to catch every word, "That's the one. The rest can wait until we know how the other thing lands." I sat in that parking lot for 4 minutes. I did not scream. I did not call him. There was one clear thought, and it arrived the way certainty always arrives, not loud, not urgent, just settled. Not yet. That was all, not yet. I called Ruth Bellemare before I called anyone else. Ruth had handled my mother's estate. She had also handled a quiet property dispute for a client of mine the year before and had managed it with a precision I had not forgotten. I had her number saved. I pulled it up and let it ring, sitting very still in that car on the side of Route 250, with the afternoon light going long across the dashboard. She picked up on the third ring. I told her what I had just seen. I told her about the key, the desk, the footage. My voice was flat and factual, the way I sound when I am presenting numbers to a client, not because I wasn't feeling anything, but because the feeling was something I had already set aside to deal with later, after the work was done. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then she said, "Claudia, do not touch anything in that house when you get back. Do not confront them, do not send a text, do not tell anyone in your family what you saw. You call me first thing tomorrow morning, and we start building the file." I asked her what we were building the file toward. She said, "Whatever they've put in motion, they haven't finished it yet. That works in your favor. Let them be one step ahead of where they think they are, and meanwhile, you download everything from that cloud archive going back 30 days and you send it to my secure email tonight. Silence is your shield right now," she said. "The footage is your sword. Don't swing it before you have to." I said I understood. She said, "Good, drive carefully." We hung up. I sat for another moment, watching the highway, watching the cars pass, watching the afternoon go about its ordinary business. Then I pulled back onto the road and I drove the rest of the way home, and I did not say a word to anyone about what I knew. Patricia's porch light was on when I turned onto the street. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for exactly 30 seconds. The house was dark from the outside. They had gone by then, or at least the lights were off. I looked at it the way you look at a place that has been touched by someone who had no right to touch it. The same white porch trim, the same 2 chairs, the same small table where my mother used to leave her coffee cup and her reading glasses. Everything the same on the surface, and something underneath it fractured in a way I would have to account for eventually, but not tonight. Tonight, I just needed Lily. She came through Patricia's door before I even knocked, launched herself at me in the driveway the way 9-year-olds do, arms around my neck, still in her school hoodie from that morning. I held on for longer than usual. Patricia stood in the doorway and gave me a look that said she understood something had happened and that she was not going to ask about it in front of Lily. I mouthed, "Thank you," over Lily's shoulder, and Patricia nodded once, the way good neighbors do, and that was enough. I got Lily to bed with her usual routine, the bath, the chapter of her book, the 10 minutes of talking about nothing in particular that she needed before she could settle. I tucked her in and she looked up at me in the lamplight and said, "Is everything okay, Mom, with the house?" I smoothed her hair back and I said, "Everything is fine. The house is ours. Nothing has changed." I said it quietly, and I meant every word of it, and I let her hear the certainty in my voice until she closed her eyes. Then I went to my office, closed the door, and opened my laptop. The next morning, Lily was quiet at breakfast. She ate her cereal and looked at the hallway that ran past the study door, the one that led to the back of the house, and then she looked back at her bowl. She did not say anything, but she did not walk down that hallway either, not once the whole morning. She took the long way around through the kitchen every time, giving the study a wide, careful berth, the way children give wide berths to things that have frightened them without knowing exactly why. I watched her do it 3 times. I set down my coffee cup and I said quietly, "Lily." She looked at me. I said, "This is still our house. Nothing in it is going to hurt you." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once and went back to her cereal, but she still took the long way around. The cloud archive went back 34 days. I started at the beginning and I worked forward, downloading every motion-triggered clip. Most of them were ordinary, Lily leaving for school, a delivery on the porch, a squirrel on the front rail. But on a Thursday 4 weeks earlier, at 11:47 in the morning, the front door opened. No car in the driveway. The front camera showed my father coming up the porch steps from the street, where he had presumably parked around the corner. He had a key. He let himself in with the calm of someone who believed he had a right to be there. He did not look behind him. He did not rush. The study camera picked him up 90 seconds later. He stood at my filing cabinet, the one by the window where I keep client files, and in the bottom drawer under H, hanging folder labeled personal. the copies of my mother's will and the property deed. He did not try to open the cabinet. He stood in front of it with his phone out. He was photographing the exterior of the drawers, the labels on the folders I kept on top of the cabinet, the deed framing on the wall, the decorative copy of the deed I had framed after the transfer, the kind of thing you do when a place finally feels like yours. He photographed that too. Then he stood very still for a moment, looking at the room, and he said something quietly that the microphone almost caught. Almost. I replayed it 4 times, and I could not make out the words, only the tone, satisfied, like a man who had confirmed something he had long suspected. He was in the house for 11 minutes. He left through the front door, locked it behind him with the key, and walked back down the street the same way he had come. I sat at my desk looking at that footage, and I felt the full, quiet weight of what it told me. He hadn't come in the heat of grief or impulse. He had come deliberately, 4 weeks before, to map the territory. The break-in today, if you could call it that, though legally that is exactly what it was not the beginning of something. It was a step in the middle of something that had already been in motion for longer than I had understood. I sent everything to Ruth's secure email before midnight. Every clip, every timestamp. The audio from that afternoon when Gareth said, "That's the one, the rest can wait until we know how the other thing lands." I labeled the folder clearly, the way I would label anything I wanted to be able to find in court. Then I went to bed. I lay in the dark and I listened to the house, to the small familiar sounds of it, the heat clicking in the pipes, the magnolia branch that tapped the study window in any kind of wind, and I thought about my mother pressing flowers in her books and making her casserole without being asked and leaving her reading glasses on the porch table. I thought about how this house was the one thing she had made absolutely sure came to me. I thought about the key on the green plastic tag, sitting in my father's jacket pocket. I thought not yet, but soon. I did not go to the storage unit the next morning. Ruth had advised me not to. She needed to document the current state first, and a visit from me before we had notified the facility could complicate things. Instead, she made a call to the storage company directly, identified herself as my attorney, and requested their access log for the previous 72 hours. The facility manager said no. He said the access logs were private customer data and that without a court order or a subpoena, he was not in a position to release them to anyone, including an attorney. He was polite about it. Ruth was polite back. She hung up and called me and said, "We have a problem." I asked what kind. She said, "The kind where they won't give us the footage voluntarily and we have to go through the court to get it, which takes time we may not have. Because if Rowena still has those boxes, every day that passes is a day she can move them further." She paused. "I'm going to file for an emergency discovery order this afternoon. I need you to write a declaration by end of day describing exactly what you saw on the camera feed. Every detail. The key, the desk, the time, what he said." I said I could do that in 2 hours. She said, "Good, do it now." I wrote the declaration at my kitchen table while Lily was at school. 3 pages, single-spaced, every detail I could pull from the footage and from memory, the brown canvas jacket, the green plastic tag, the exact words Gareth said into the study's microphone. I sent it to Ruth at 2:15. She filed the emergency discovery motion at 4. The judge issued the order the next morning at 9:47. Ruth had the access logs by noon. Storage facilities are required to keep these. The log came back and showed my unit had been accessed at 8:22 that morning, less than 16 hours after I watched my father take the key from my mother's writing desk. And the unit's own internal camera showed Rowena and a man I did not initially recognize unloading 3 large boxes into a rented pickup truck. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the image Ruth forwarded me. The man with Rowena was not my father. He was someone in his 30s, heavyset, wearing a jacket from a local moving company, which meant they had hired help, which meant they had planned this down to the logistics. This was not a spontaneous act of grief or entitlement. This was organized. Someone had thought through the steps. Someone had decided the storage unit needed to be cleared before I could secure it. Ruth called me that afternoon. Her voice had a particular quality when the facts of a case were assembling into something she could use, a steadiness that I recognized, because I had the same cue. Uality in my own voice when I was looking at a client's accounts and could see exactly what had gone wrong and exactly how to fix it. She said, "There's more. Can you talk?" I said I could. She said, "I pulled the court filings for Richmond Circuit Court this morning. There's a petition filed 8 days ago, a challenge to your mother's will on grounds of diminished capacity. Your father is the petitioner. Your sister is listed as a supporting witness. They've retained a local firm, Crane and Whitmore. And before you ask, yes, Dorothea Crane is a named partner." The room was very quiet for a moment. I said, "Dorothea filed on behalf of my father?" Ruth said, "Dorothea's firm represents him. The filings were made 8 days ago. The break-in was yesterday. The storage unit was this morning. Claudia, this wasn't impulsive. The legal action was the first move. What happened at your house was them trying to remove evidence, specifically your mother's personal papers and valuables, before any court could inventory them." I stood at the kitchen window looking at the magnolia tree in the side yard. My mother had always said it bloomed late, every year, like it was deciding whether it felt like it this time, and then it would open all at once, enormous and white and completely inevitable. I said, "What do we do?" Ruth said. "We respond to the court filing today. We file a police report for the trespass and theft. We request an emergency order preserving all estate assets. And then we let them think they're still a step ahead, because in about 2 weeks, your father's aunt is hosting a family gathering to talk things through, and that is where we hand them the full picture. In their own house. In front of everyone who has watched them run this family for 30 years. She paused, then she said, "They want a family reckoning. We'll give them one." I drove to Patricia's that evening to update her on the basics. She had seen the car. She had been with Lily. She deserved to know enough to understand why I might be a little quieter than usual in the coming weeks. She sat across from me at her kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea and listened without interrupting, which is the thing I have always loved about Patricia. She does not rush the space between what you've said and what she's going to say next. When I finished, she put her mug down and said, "Claudia, your mother always said you were the still one. She said it like it was the best thing about you." I looked at her. She said, "She was right. You hold on to it." I said I intended to. I drove home and checked the locks and sat in my mother's chair in the living room with my laptop. And I made a list, a clean, methodical, financial advisor list of every piece of evidence I had, every piece I was still waiting on, and every step between where I was and where I needed to be. It took me 40 minutes. When I was done, I folded the laptop closed and I sat in the quiet house and I said nothing at all, not even to myself. I just let the silence do what it had always done in this house, settle over everything like something earned. The next 10 days moved the way careful work always moves, slowly on the surface, very fast underneath. Ruth filed the trespass report with Richmond Police on Tuesday morning. The officer who took the initial report was matter-of-fact about it, which I appreciated. She asked for the footage. I had it formatted and time-stamped and exported to a USB drive before the appointment, along with a printed log of every clip, every date, every duration, cross-referenced to the storage facility's access log. The officer looked at the packet and then looked at me. "You did this yourself?" I said yes. She said, "What do you do for work?" I said I was a financial advisor. She nodded like that explained everything, and maybe it did. The police report number went into Ruth's emergency motion to the circuit court that same afternoon, a motion to preserve all estate assets, enjoin any further transfers, and require the return of the items removed from the storage unit. The motion cited the footage, the access log, and the will contest petition Gareth had filed 8 days earlier. It was 14 pages. Ruth sent me a copy that evening and I read every page twice, the way I read any document that has my name on it and matters. By Wednesday, the court had issued a temporary preservation order. By Thursday, my father had been served. I know he was served on Thursday because Rowena texted me for the first time in 6 weeks. She did not mention the storage unit or the house. She said, "Dad got some legal papers. He's very upset. You should call him." I read the message. I put my phone face down on my desk. I went back to the quarterly report I was building for a client. I did not reply. Delia came over Thursday evening. She had been my closest friend since our first year at University of Richmond, the kind of friend you call we. And something happens and you need someone who will sit with you in the actual feeling of it before they start trying to fix it. I had told her the basics the day before, in a phone call that lasted 2 hours and covered the footage, Ruth, the court filing, and the storage unit. And by the end of it, Delia had cycled through astonished, furious, and quietly ferocious in a way that I found genuinely comforting. She arrived with wine and the good cheese from the shop on Carey Street, and she sat on my kitchen counter the way she had been sitting on kitchen counters since we were 22, and she said, "Walk me through the whole thing again. From the parking lot." So I did. She listened with her wine glass halfway to her mouth, and she did not interrupt once, which for Delia was a significant achievement. When I finished, she said, "They thought you were the easy one." I said, "They always thought I was the easy one," she said, "and you just let them go on thinking that." I looked at her. I said, "What would you have done differently?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nothing, not one thing." She topped off my glass. We sat in the kitchen that my mother had cooked in for 40 years, and we talked until late. And the house was warm. And for the first time since the parking lot on Route 250, I felt the particular solidity of being exactly where you are supposed to be. On Friday, I drove to the storage unit. Ruth had cleared it. The preservation order meant everything needed to be formally inventoried before any further action, and she had arranged for a licensed appraiser to meet us there. The facility manager let us in with their master key, since mine was still in my father's jacket pocket, presumably. 3 boxes were gone. The manager pulled the internal camera footage and we watched it together on her office monitor, Rowena and the man in the moving company jacket, carrying the boxes out at 8:22 on Tuesday morning. The manager was apologetic. I told her it wasn't her responsibility. I was careful and pleasant, the way I am when I need something from someone and they are genuinely blameless. I needed her cooperation and her footage, and I got both. What remained in the unit was significant. 2 more boxes of photos and books, my mother's sewing cabinet, a wrapped painting that had hung in the front room of my grandmother's house for as long as I could remember, and a small safe bolted to the rear wall that I had never opened because I had not yet found the combination. I mentioned the safe to Ruth that afternoon. There was a pause on her end of the phone. She said, "Do you have any of your mother's papers? Journals, diaries, any personal documents from the last few years?" I said I had a box of them at the house, from her writing desk. Ruth said, "Look for a combination. Any sequence of numbers she wrote down, any pattern, dates, addresses, anything." She said it the way she says things when she has a reason but isn't ready to say it yet. I went home and I sat at my mother's writing desk, the same desk Rowena had been going through, the fold-down lid now closed and perfectly ordinary looking, and I went through every compartment myself. I found the combination on the 3rd try. It was not written down anywhere. It was the month and year of the deed transfer. The month and year the house became mine. My mother had made it the combination to whatever was in that safe, and she had not told me, and I sat at her desk with the light coming through the study window, and I pressed my hands flat on the felt writing surface, and I did not move for a long time. Ruth opened the safe the following Monday with the facility manager present and the appraiser logging everything. Inside, a velvet pouch containing my grandmother's diamond earrings and a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother before her. A sealed envelope addressed in my mother's handwriting to Claudia, when the time comes, and a folded document, notarized, dated 11 months before her death. That was an addendum to her will. A personal property memorandum, the kind that specifies by name who gets particular items of personal property outside the main estate process. My mother had listed every piece of jewelry in the safe, by description, and assigned them all to me. She had also listed the writing desk, the painting, the sewing cabinet, the china. Everything my father and sister had been looking for, everything they had come into my house to find. And beneath the memorandum, in my mother's careful handwriting, a single page that was not a legal document, just a letter. I read it alone that evening in the chair by the living room window. I am not going to tell you everything it said. But I will tell you that my mother knew in the last year of her life exactly what her ex-husband intended to do. She had expected it. She had prepared for it. She had left me the tools, the memorandum, the safe, the combination. That was the date of the deed, and she had trusted me to find them when I needed them. The letter ended, "You were always the still one. Stay still, my love, until the moment is right. You'll know when." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, and I sat very quietly in the house that was mine, and I breathed in and I breathed out, and I let the silence do its work. Lily found me there 10 minutes later. She had come home from Patricia's and done it quietly, the way she had been doing most things quietly that week, and she stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at me in the chair with the envelope in my hands. She said, "Mom, can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Is Grandpa Gareth coming back?" I looked at her. She was standing with her hands at her sides, the way she stands when she is trying to be grown up about something that is frightening her. I said, "No." She said, "Is he going to try to take our house?" I said, "He is going to try, and he is going to fail." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and climbed into the chair beside me, the way she used to when she was smaller, fitting herself into the space between me and the armrest. I put my arm around her. Neither of us said anything for a while. The house was quiet and entirely ours, and that was enough. Ruth called me that Wednesday morning, 12 days after the parking lot on Route 250. She said, "Dorothea Crane is hosting a family gathering this Sunday. Did you know?" I said I hadn't been invited. She said, "You're about to be. Your father is going to call you today or tomorrow and invite you himself. He needs you there. The Will Challenge has a better optics argument if it looks like the family is trying to resolve things together rather than going straight to litigation. He wants you to come alone and come uncert. He has his attorney from Crane and Whitmore planning to be there too, to walk you through a settlement proposal." I asked her how she knew all of this. She said a former colleague of hers at Crane and Whitmore had reached out informally, nothing improper, just a professional heads up that the situation was more organized than it appeared. I said, "How organized?" She said, "They've drafted a quitclaim deed for you to sign, transferring a 50% interest in the house to your father. The settlement proposal includes the return of the items from the storage unit in exchange for your signature. They expect you to come in overwhelmed by the legal pressure and take the deal because it feels like the easier path." The room was very quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the magnolia tree was doing what it always did, holding its enormous green stillness in the May light, deciding, as my mother used to say, whether it felt like blooming yet. I looked at it. I said, "Ruth, I would like you to be there on Sunday." She said, "I was planning on it." I've also filed the response to the Will Challenge this morning, and I've attached to it, as exhibits, the police footage, the storage access log, the appraiser's inventory, and your mother's personal property memorandum. She paused. "They don't know about the memorandum. They don't know about the safe. They don't know the letter exists." Another pause. "They are about to walk into a room thinking they have the advantage. I'd like to let them have that feeling for exactly as long as it takes you to sit down." I said, "Sunday works for me." My father called Saturday afternoon. He called from his landline, which he always did when he wanted to sound formal, like the landline conveyed a gravity that a cell phone didn't. I let it ring twice. Then I answered the way I answer most calls, calmly, warmly, like nothing in particular was happening. "Claudia," he said, "it's your father." I said, "I know, Dad." He cleared his throat. He said Dorothea was having people over Sunday afternoon and that he thought it would be good if I came, a chance to talk things through as a family, before things get any more complicated. He said he knew the last few weeks had been hard. He said he wanted to understand my perspective. He said he thought there were some misunderstandings that could be resolved. I listened to all of it, every careful, calibrated word. I had been listening to this voice my entire life, had learned to hear the gaps between what it said and what it meant, the way you learn to read a balance sheet and understand that the number on the surface and the health of the underlying account are sometimes very different things. I said, "Of course." "What time?" He said 2 o'clock. I said I'd be there. He sounded relieved, which told me he had expected resistance and had prepared for it and now had to recalibrate. And I almost felt sorry for the recalibration effort that was about to be entirely wasted. I hung up and texted Ruth, Sunday, 2 o'clock, Dorothea's. She replied immediately, already have the binder printed, see. You at 1:30. I stood at my kitchen counter for a moment. I thought about what I was going to wear. I decided on the navy linen dress my mother had given me 2 birthdays ago, the one she said made me look settled. I thought that was exactly right. I left Lily with Patricia again on Sunday. I told Lily I was going to a family meeting and that it might run a little long and that we would have dinner together after. She could pick anywhere she wanted. She said she wanted Thai food from the place on Grove Avenue. I said done. She hugged me and went back to her book. I stood in Patricia's doorway for a moment and looked at the back of Lily's head, the particular way her hair sat in its ponytail. And I thought about all the things I was doing and all the reasons I was doing them, and I felt entirely calm. Ruth was waiting in her car outside Dorothea's house when I pulled up at 1:28. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and had her briefcase on the passenger seat and a second bag that I recognized as the kind used for document transport. Structured, with a strap, the kind you see at depositions. She got out of the car and we stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and she looked at me the way she always does just before something consequential. Steadily, professionally, with a particular attention that means she has already run through every likely scenario and has a response prepared for each one. She said, "You ready?" I said yes. She said, "Remember, let me open, don't speak first. Let them set out the whole proposal before you say a single word." I said I understood. She said, "They will feel sorry for you, let them. That feeling is very useful to us in the next 90 minutes. I said, "Ruth." She looked at me. I said, "I've been letting them feel sorry for me my entire life." She smiled just slightly, the way she smiles when something confirms a calculation she already made. She picked up her briefcase. We walked to the door together. Dorothea's house was a large colonial in Richmond's West End, the kind of house that had been added onto over several decades, and had the slightly crowded grandeur of a family that believed in keeping things, rooms, and relatives. The living room was formal. The dining room table had been extended to seat 8. When Dorothea opened the door, she was wearing her Sunday clothes and her Sunday expression, the beneficent, slightly sorrowful look she deployed whenever family difficulties needed to be managed from above. She glanced at Ruth, and her expression shifted, fractionally, the way expressions shift when something unexpected walks in alongside something expected. She said, "Claudia, you brought an attorney." Her voice was careful. I said, "You know Ruth Bellemare." Dorothea said, "Of course." "Ruth." There was a pause in which several things went unsaid, and then Dorothea stepped back and let us in. The room held my father, Gareth, in the large chair by the fireplace, his chair, by right of seniority, at every family gathering I had attended since childhood. Rowena was on the sofa, in a silk blouse, looking like she had dressed for a victory. Beside her was a man I recognized from his firm's website as Warren Pittman, the Crane and Whitmore associate who had prepared the will contest petition. Young, careful, the kind of attorney who was very good at paperwork and had perhaps not yet been in many rooms where the paperwork didn't go the way it was supposed to. And Dorothea's husband, a quiet man named Fletcher who had learned long ago to take up as little space as possible at these gatherings, hovering near the kitchen with the look of someone who had been told to be present and had decided to interpret that as minimally as possible. My father looked up when I came in. He looked at Ruth's briefcase. Something moved across his face, not quite a flinch, and then it was gone, replaced by the assembled gravity he had been preparing since Saturday. He said, "Claudia, thank you for coming." I said, "Of course, Dad." I sat down across from him and folded my hands in my lap and I waited. Pittman opened. That was clearly the plan, to have the attorney establish the frame before the family dynamics could complicate things. He was smooth and practiced, the way young attorneys are when they have a strong brief and expect the other side to be unrepresented. He said there were concerns about the validity of the original will, given the documented cognitive decline of my mother in her final years. He said the family only wanted fairness. He said the proposed arrangement, a 50% interest in the house transferred to my father in exchange for a full cessation of any legal challenges, was a reasonable resolution that saved everyone time, expense, and further family pain. He slid the quitclaim deed across the table as he spoke. The way you slide something across a table when you want the physical presence of it to make the abstract feel inevitable. Rut. H did not touch it. I did not touch it. I looked at it the way I look at a piece of paper that contains a number I already know is wrong. Pittman finished. The room was quiet for a moment. Rowena was looking at me with an expression that was trying to be sympathetic and could not quite get all the way there. My father had his hands folded the same way mine were, as if he had practiced the mirror of my posture to suggest equivalence between our positions. Dorothea stood near the mantel like a statue of herself. Ruth opened her briefcase. She said, "Thank you, Warren. Before we discuss the proposal, I'd like to share a few documents that will help contextualize the full picture for everyone in the room." She took out the exhibit binder, clean, tabbed, professionally printed, and set it on the table. She took out the flash drive. She took out her laptop and opened it on the side table and connected the flash drive with the deliberate ease of someone who has done this many times and is not in any hurry. She said, "I'll start with Exhibit A." Exhibit A was the footage from Monday afternoon, the study camera, time-stamped, my father in his brown canvas jacket with his hand in my mother's writing desk, lifting the storage key from the lower compartment. The room was very quiet as it played. Warren Pittman watched it with the expression of a man recalculating several things simultaneously. Rowena's composure held, but her hands tightened in her lap. My father sat very still. Ruth said, "Exhibit B, the front camera, 4 weeks earlier." My father letting himself in with a spare key, the calm of a man who believed he had a right to be there. 11 minutes inside. The study camera picking him up photographing documents. Dorothea made a small sound that she converted quickly into silence, but I heard it. Fletcher, in the kitchen doorway, had gone very still in a different way. The stillness of a bystander who has just understood that he is in a room where something is happening that he wants no part of. Ruth said, "Exhibit C is the storage facility access log, timestamped 8:22 Tuesday morning, cross-referenced with the facility's internal camera footage showing Rowena Fairfax, and an associate removing 3 boxes from the unit belonging to the estate of Margaret Fairfax." She paused. Those boxes contained items specifically assigned to Claudia in the personal property memorandum attached to Margaret's will, a memorandum notarized 11 months before her death, which is Exhibit D. The memorandum went on the table. Pittman reached for it. He read the first page, and I watched his posture shift slightly. The way posture shifts when the document in your hand has just changed the shape of the room you're sitting in. Ruth said, "Finally, Exhibit E, the response to the will contest petition, filed with Richmond Circuit Court Thursday morning, attaching all of the above as exhibits, and additionally noting that Margaret Fairfax's treating neurologist has submitted a declaration confirming that at the time of the will's execution, her capacity was fully intact and documented. The petition's foundational claim is, in the court's preliminary view, without merit." She closed the binder. She looked at Warren Pittman. She said, "The quitclaim deed is not something my client is going to sign. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss?" The silence in Dorothea's living room was total. My father looked at the table. Rowena was looking at the binder. Pittman was looking at his phone. I suspected he was already beginning a text to someone at his firm. Dorothea was the only one looking at me. Her expression had changed completely. The sorrowful beneficence was gone. In its place was something I had never seen on her face before, not in 30-odd years of Sunday gatherings and holiday dinners and family photographs. Something that looked very close to reckoning. I looked back at her, and then, for the first time since I had walked through the door, I spoke. I said it quietly. That is the only way I know how to say the things that matter. I said, "You came into my house looking for something to take from me. I let you look. I watched every second. And now you're going to give it all back in front of everyone here or in front of a judge. Your choice." I looked at my father. I said, "You want to talk about what Mom would have wanted?" She would have wanted her 9-year-old granddaughter to stop taking the long way around her own hallway because she's afraid of the room you walked through. That's what you did. That's what this was. The room was very still. Nobody spoke. My father looked up. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when I was 17 and had said something that didn't fit the version of me he had been carrying in his head, surprised, recalibrating, looking for the angle he had missed. He opened his mouth. I waited. He closed it again. He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him. It the patient professional blankness of someone who has all day. Rowena said, "Claudia, this is not what we were just trying to protect what was Mom's." I looked at my sister. I said, "Then you should have asked me. I have the recordings of what you said while you were in my house, Rowena. Would you like me to play the part about how the rest could wait until you knew how the other thing landed?" Rowena was quiet. I said, "That's what I thought." I was not angry when I said it. I want to be clear about that. I was exactly as calm as I had been in the parking lot on Route 250, as calm as I had been all through those 10 days, as calm as my mother's house at 11 o'clock at night with the heat in the pipes and the magnolia tapping the window. This was not anger. This was the ending of something that had been building for a very long time. Warren Pittman said, carefully, that he would need to consult with his client before any further discussion. Ruth said that was perfectly reasonable and that the motion for return of all removed estate items had a response deadline of Friday, so he should keep that in mind for his timeline. She closed her laptop. She put the flash drive in her briefcase. She stood up. I stood up. I looked at my father one more time and he was looking at his hands. I said, "I'll have Ruth's office send you the locksmith documentation for the spare key. It's been voided as of last Tuesday." He did not look up. I said, "Take care, Dad." And then I walked out of Dorothea Crane's living room and through her front door and down the steps to the sidewalk. And the May afternoon was warm and the magnolia trees along the street were in full bloom, enormous and white and completely, utterly inevitable. The will contest was withdrawn 10 days later. Warren Pittman filed the withdrawal without comment. The Richmond Circuit Court issued a formal notation acknowledging the withdrawal and dismissing the petition. My father's trespassing charge was not withdrawn. The Commonwealth's attorney reviewed the footage and the police report and determined there was sufficient basis to proceed. He was charged with misdemeanor breaking and entering, technically, because he had a key. The charge was unlawful entry, and given a deferred disposition on the condition that he have no contact with me, my property, or my daughter for 3 years. He took the deal without going to trial. His attorney was not Warren Pittman. Pittman had withdrawn from the case 2 days after Dorothea's living room, citing a conflict of interest that he did not specify, but that I suspect had something to do with his sudden clearer understanding of what the footage contained, and who had known what when. Rowena was charged separately for the theft of the estate items. She retained her own attorney, negotiated a civil settlement, and returned everything within the 30-day order window: the velvet pouch, the photo albums, the boxes of china wrapped in moving blankets, all of it back in the storage unit by the 4th week of June, inventoried and signed for in the presence of Ruth's paralegal. Rowena did not make eye contact during the return. I was not there for it. Ruth handled it and sent me the receipt. Dorothea Crane had her own accounting, though it came from an unexpected direction. A cousin of mine, my mother's niece, a woman named Harriet who had always quietly disapproved of the way Dorothea ran the family as a personal fiefdom, had been at the gathering as a last-minute add-on, sitting in the back corner of the dining room where neither I nor, apparently, Dorothea had fully registered her presence. Harriet had listened to the entire proceeding. Harriet was also on the board of the Family Charitable Trust that Dorothea had chaired for 11 years. Within a month, Harriet had convened an emergency board meeting and presented her own set of questions, not about me or my house, but about the trust's financial management under Dorothea's tenure, questions that Ruth later told me had been circulating quietly for years and had simply never had the right moment to surface. Dorothea resigned the chairmanship in July. The audit that followed was not kind to her legacy. I had nothing to do with it directly, but I would be lying if I said I was surprised. I did not speak to my father for a long time after that Sunday. There was a period in which I thought I might, eventually, in which I held open the theoretical possibility, the way you hold open a door you're not sure you're going through. But the restraining order ran for 3 years, and in those 3 years I discovered something I had not fully expected. The silence that had always been asked of me in relation to my father had been, for my whole life, a silence in service of his comfort. The silence I chose after Dorothea's living room was a different kind entirely. It was mine. It held something he had never understood was there, and I found I did not particularly miss the alternative. Lily had her Thai food on Sunday evening. She sat across from me at the table on our porch, the same table with the same two chairs, and she told me about a book she was reading about a girl who found a map in an old house and followed it into an adventure, and I listened to every word. The magnolia tree in the side yard had finished blooming by then. The blossoms were on the grass in white drifts, the way they went every year, enormous and extravagant, and then quietly, completely done. The evening light was the particular gold it gets in Richmond in May, the kind that makes everything look like it has been there forever, like it was always going to be exactly this. I had my coffee. I watched my daughter talk with her hands the way she always does when she's excited about something. I thought about my mother pressing flowers in books. I thought about the index card with the casserole recipe, tucked between chicken and dumplings and lemon pound cake, where it would stay as long as I lived in this house. I thought about the combination to the safe, the month and year the house became mine, and I thought about my mother choosing that number, knowing I would find it when I needed it, trusting me with the tool and the silence and the patience to use it right. Fairfax Advisory had its strongest quarter on record that summer. Ruth referred 2 new clients to me through her network, people who had heard, at second or third hand, about the airtight documentation and the steady way I had handled things. I did not advertise the story. I did not have to. Precision speaks quietly, and the right people hear it. I hired an assistant in the fall, a young woman named Clem who was finishing her master's in financial planning and had a particular gift for organization and a tendency to notice details other people missed. I recognized the tendency immediately. I told her on her first day, always back up to the cloud and always keep 30 days. She asked why 30 instead of 7. I said, because sometimes you don't know what you're looking for until 3 weeks after it happened. She wrote it down. I think she'll be fine. The house is ours. It was always ours. It will stay ours. And when people ask me how I handled it, the waiting, the watching, the 10 days of saying nothing while everything moved underneath the surface, I tell them what my mother told me, in a letter I keep in the inside pocket of my winter coat. Stillness, held long enough, held with the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly what they're waiting for, that is not passive. It never was. She said nothing. She remembered everything. She won. One more thing. A few weeks after the family meeting, Lily walked straight down that hallway past the study door, past the camera, all the way to the back of the house, without taking the long way around. She didn't say anything about it. She just did it. I stood in the kitchen and I watched her go, and I did not say a word. I just let her have it. The house, the hallway, the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of a 9-year-old who had stopped being afraid of her own home. That was the win that mattered most. Everything else was paperwork. If you've ever let your silence do the work for you, if you've ever stayed completely still while someone assumed they had the advantage, and waited and watched type hush in the comments. I read every one. And tell me this, was her silence her greatest weapon, or did she wait too long? I want to know what you think. Drop your answer below and let's talk about it. If she did the right thing, leave a heart in the comments, and subscribe if you're new here, because a fresh story drops every single week. Until next time, stay quiet, stay dangerous.